What on earth happened in our city this week? We're lifting the hood on the Metro's most impactful local news stories. It's your Kansas City Week Reviewed. Next.
Week in Review is made possible through the generous support of Dave and Jamie Cummings, Bob and Marlise Gorley, Smithfield Foods, Haas and Wilkerson Insurance, the Courtney S. Turner Charitable Trust, John H. Mize and Bank of America N.A. co-trustees, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome everyone, I'm Nick Haynes and I'm glad to have you as our travel companion on this journey through the week's top local news stories, rolling up their sleeves to connect the dots on the biggest stories of our week. From KCTV5 News, reporter Caroline Sweeney, and from KMBC 9 News, chief political reporter Michael Mahoney, nationally syndicated columnist Mary Sanchez with the Tribune News Service, and Dave Helling of your Kansas City Star. It's unfortunate that many of us have now become accustomed to one homicide after another in Kansas City, but this week the murder count brought with it national attention, and even for a moment, the attention of the leading Democratic candidates for president.
We want to start here with some breaking news. A shooting at a Kansas City bar overnight, leaving 4 people dead.
It was America's latest mass shooting, and the murder scene, the Tequila KC bar in Kansas City, Kansas. 4 people shot to death, 5 others injured in that attack. Whenever there's a tragedy of this magnitude, there are 2 inevitable questions. Could this have been prevented? And how do you stop it from happening again? Are we any closer to answers to either of those questions this week, Michael?
No, I don't think so at all. And I just do not see how an incident like this is preventable, and the solutions that people keep coming forward with probably wouldn't have done it. Both these men were convicted felons. They shouldn't have had guns, but any felon, anybody can get a gun. I don't think that there was any way anybody could have foreseen this, even though the cops showed up there a couple hours earlier, because there was a ruckus in the bar. There's just no way that they would have known it was going to turn out that way, and it's impractical to think that the cops could sit on that bar.
When you look at news commentary and a lot of the social media feeds, certainly people are pointing plenty of fingers, though, Mary, including, as Mike mentions, about the police who arrived earlier in the night, then left. But is it inconceivable or unrealistic to expect that police would remain there indefinitely because they think they may come back, even if there were other service calls coming in?
I think the only thing that you could possibly question the police on is that the bar that night didn't have their regular security guard. And so maybe you could have had a bit of a longer conversation, and perhaps they did, about, well, maybe we'll circle back, and they might have done that as well, the police to come back by. Unfortunately, bartenders all across the United States, all across the world, know that, and I don't care what the price point is in the bar for the drink, they know that you're going to get a belligerent customer. Yeah. Every bartender has refused service, been threatened. It happens, unfortunately, too often. How police deal with that is an ongoing question. Unfortunately, also in Kansas City, Kansas, there was another shooting like that. I knew the lady. Lori Reynolds died. The Gossip Inn, she refused service. It was 2008. The guy came back with a gun and killed her. So it's awful, but I don't know how you prevent this sort of a thing.
There's also finger-pointing, Caroline Sweeney, at the court system that both suspects in this case were out on bail at the time, one facing charges of assaulting a Jackson County Sheriff's deputy, the other on 3 felony counts. But are there factors we're not aware of that might explain why that happened?
Well, we know that there have been some changes in Missouri regulations dealing with how judges assign bond. You know, there's a lot of talk about how many people are being put in jail on really high bond that doesn't necessarily meet the charges. And when we're looking at that, Missouri regulations now say judges have to be really aware of assigning bond that isn't excessive. So you are looking at a long list of felony charges, but with these new bond regulations, they have to be aware of the amount of money they're assigning to them.
And just sort of piggyback on that, the change that Caroline's talking about is virtually brand new. It happened earlier this year. It went into effect in July. So they're dealing with a very new set of circumstances in terms of how judges are supposed to approach this. I assume there's going to be pressure now to revisit this.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just add this. I think there will be more focus on the courts and the rules involved. We're involved in a project at the Star now about the Public Defender's Office. This will come up in the context of that story as we continue to report on it. But Michael's right, this is unavoidable in part because this nation is awash in weapons. There are 300 million guns out there. And when you have that many guns in circulation, retaliation and shootings and murders and gang warfare is almost inevitable. And so there could have been better court performance, perhaps better performance by the police, perhaps security guards. But when you have this much weaponry in the hands of the people, these incidents, sadly, are going to continue.
The chief of police in Wichita looking at what was happening in Kansas City, Kansas with horror. They're also seeing a huge spike in violent crime and homicides in Wichita. He calls for specific measures, one including allowing police, more measures for police, to allow them to close problem businesses, number one. Another, to actually take a gun out of the hands of a known gang member. But what appetite is there in the state of Kansas, in Topeka, to do any of those things?
Well, when you talk to people who focus on violent crime on the community level, you are going to hear a multi-tiered, a multifaceted approach to dealing with violent crime. And one of them is getting more mental health services available for people, you know, talking about how people deal with their anger and conflict resolution. You hear about it in Topeka, especially when you're looking at state hospitals and state resources that are available. I think when you're talking about closing down problem businesses, that's going to have to be not so much at the state level, but at the county and city level. I think 41 Action News found that there were 80 calls for service for the bar in the last 5 years, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you're looking at a nuisance rate, you have to start adding those things together.
And when we look for solutions to this one mass shooting, we should point out, of course, there were 4 other people who died in our metropolitan area this week, including a Wyandotte County deputy who was shot, it seems the suspect being his own son, a man on his front porch in Kansas City, Missouri, shot dead. So we have lots of other murders happening at the same time this mass shooting is occurring.
Absolutely. And again, to Dave's point, though, guns were used in almost every one of these. So you do have to look at what we're doing with legislation around guns. I think Kansas is getting a little bit closer in terms of taking away guns from people who have domestic violence convictions.
I wouldn't hope or foresee much change in that. It's just because of the nature of of Kansas and Missouri. I don't think that there's going to be much restriction either at the state level on this. The climate in these states is not there.
Now, the shooting at a bar in Kansas City, Kansas wasn't the only crime story putting Kansas City in the national news spotlight. This is a story that made international news. It's the 12-year-old middle school student in the Shawnee Mission School District arrested for forming a gun with her fingers and pointing at 4 students. It happened in Westridge Middle School in Overland Park. The 12-year-old girl was led out of the school in handcuffs and has since been charged with a felony. What is the felony here, though, Caroline?
Well, I think the most interesting part of this, whether or not we're looking at was this actually an appropriate felony charge or not, is what Steve Howe, the district attorney in Johnson County, said. He said that they don't agree with charging this 12-year-old girl with pointing her fingers at people. I think there was a question asked of her by another student. I can't remember the exact nature of the question, but she was responding to
who
someone.
would you like to kill in your class?
Oh, yeah, that's right, Michael. Yeah, that's right.
So she says, who would you like to kill? Mm-hmm. And she points to 4 students and then points to herself. So does that change the nature of the danger factor here, Mary?
I don't think it changes it. It adds to it for me. I mean, that's a child that is talking about their own suicide. It needs to be handled within the school. I mean, I just wonder if there's more to it in that. What was the context of how does that conversation even come up? Did they think they were joking? Had there been other issues with this child, with these other students that she pointed out? You just don't know the broader context, and we shouldn't. I mean, it is a private matter somewhat because it's a juvenile. Everyone needs to be concerned, though, if we're charging and throwing in handcuffs a 12-year-old.
The girl's grandfather tells reporters, I think this is something that probably could have been handled in the principal's office and got completely out of hand. But don't zero tolerance policies block that room for negotiation?
They can, and let's just be clear and fair. School districts are hyper worried about these incidents for good reason. I mean, Sandy Hook is one of the greatest stains on, America in its history. So the districts are all worried about it. Having said that, and based on what we know, it seems like this was much more appropriately handled in some sort of counseling, professional attention mode rather than arrest and potential trial or attempt to convict this young lady who obviously needs some help. And you know, you do wonder why the police department didn't recognize that more readily.
Because it wasn't the Shawnee Mission School District
Correct.
who
They had
made
nothing
the
to do
arrest.
with it,
They said
right.
this was the Overland Park Police Department.
Correct,
It's
correct.
a school resource officer that handled it. And I'm sure school resource officers in Kansas City, Kansas School District handled the 2 threats that they had this week. They had one at J.C. Harmon and another one, I think it was at Argentine Middle School. So this, I mean, in the same week, our community has had 3 issues with this that we know of.
Yeah. Can I just say quickly, this relating it to the Kansas City, Kansas mass shooting story? It's so easy for all of us to second guess these decisions after the fact, the decisions of judges, of police, of security officers, of school resource officers. And I would just say we need to be a little careful because you're not in the moment, you don't understand that, you know, the circumstances of each incident. Having said that, common sense seems to be sometimes difficult to find in these incidents.
What role should the local police have in enforcing our nation's immigration laws? This week, citizens packed the council chamber in Roland Park as the city began deliberating on a new policy that would prohibit the use of local law enforcement resources to carry out federal immigration and customs enforcement actions.
We're planning on welcoming unknown thousands of impoverished federal fugitives to Roland Park.
The story also attracting the attention of U.S. Senate candidate Chris Kobach, the Kansas Republican, calling on the U.S. Senate to deny federal funds to Roland Park for violating federal law.
If they are not going to assist the federal government in removing dangerous illegal aliens from the streets of our country, then they should not be entitled to any federal funds.
Now, we should make it clear that the city of Roland Park is only considering the policy change. They haven't voted on it yet. But what has been the response from Roland Park officials, Caroline?
Well, they want to make that extremely clear that there has been no policy change. When I was sitting and talking to Mayor Mike Kelly, I asked him, why did people come to the meeting thinking there was going to be some vote? If you listen to the public comment, everyone is saying, vote this down. There was no vote. It was a directive by their police chief to the police officers saying, you know, we have limited number of resources and police officers available. There are things that we can do to help immigration officers, but if you need to exert more effort on one person, you have to get my go-ahead first. And I think that is something that has been in discussion in the Roland Park Police Department and inside city government, which is why government officials inside the process are looking from the outside in a very different way than people looking in.
Now, from our viewers, we're hearing concerns about are the police deciding which laws are being enforced and which aren't. Shouldn't all laws be enforced? If this is against the law, you know, are the police deciding other things that they're not going to enforce?
No, I don't think so. I mean, here's the reality of it. Immigration is a federal jurisdiction. Roland Park has always been, and it sounds like is still in line with all the major police departments in the country. They are regulated to do their own municipal laws. Do they also come in and help with immigration enforcement when asked and when there's a federal warrant? Absolutely they do. We're at the crossroads, I-35 and I-70. It's not like police departments, as Chris Kobach will say, are sanctuary. They're not at all. But they are dealing with their own laws. And they also know that they cannot go out and disrupt immigrant communities in ways that are going to undercut their own ability to solve crime later.
Michael.
When this story emerged, the first thing I thought of was the story previous from this year that had these dramatic pictures of a Kansas City police officer smashing open a window to have ICE assist ICE in an arrest. The local police departments are not in the immigration enforcement business, and they're put into a very difficult position when they're asked to call that up. I think that's why the cops in Roland Park wanted, the chief wanted some sort of policies set in there because they get put in between a rock and a hard spot.
KCI Airport back in the headlines. Developers behind the new single terminal project are being blasted again over how many jobs they're giving to locals. Just 3% of work on the $1.5 billion project is being done by local workers. But what difference does that really make, Dave Helling? Is this really a violation of the campaign promises made when voters said yes to this?
Well, you have to go back and look at those promises, which were disturbingly vague at this point, because they talk about local area jobs. And let's be clear, the 3% figure, which actually came out earlier this summer, and then was talked about a couple of weeks ago again by the City Council, involves just Kansas City, Missouri workers to date. And Edgemoor, the developer on the project, has said, and did say again when I talked to them this week, that you need to be patient. We're going to ramp up more construction out at the airport. When that happens, more Kansas City, Missouri workers will be on the payroll. But not required by the contract, not required by any formal pledge by Edgemoor or any other group. And if the number stays in the single digits, Nick, which it could because of the need for skilled labor at the airport, it's going to be an interesting political dilemma.
But it's not like
council.
they're flying in people from California
Correct.
and Pennsylvania
Correct,
to do this
no.
job. Edgemoor, Michael Mahoney, saying that 90% of the workforce is from either Kansas or Missouri. Doesn't that meet the definition of local?
Yeah, when this popped earlier this summer during a presentation, an update on the airport development, eyebrows got raised then, but people were also quick to say, look, we are in single digits in terms of the percentage of the work that is underway there, and there's going to be something like 5 million work hours, an enormous number that's going to go into this. And the numbers that are being cited here are from the very early stages of this. I think people are getting their knickers all tied up here when they don't necessarily need it.
And do you think most voters and citizens of Kansas City are more interested in knowing that this will be done on time, on budget, than who's actually working on the project? Or am I wrong about that?
No, I think right now what a lot of people are thinking about is the budget that's already gone up. We saw it go up and we heard an outcry there. You know, getting to the airport, which I'll be doing later this afternoon, is already a pain because of construction. But I think that's the focus now. What you're going to see on the back end when the project is done is they're going to see that number, and that's what they'll hold politicians accountable for. You promised work in our community. Did we get that promise?
Which is why it's important to get your knickers up now, because Mike's right.
Okay.
It's not. It doesn't make a difference now. But if we wait 2 or 3 years and get upset about it, and it's still at 3 or 4%, it will be a political issue.
It's not going to be, and I'll take care of my own knickers.
We're going to show you some video right now so we can make a knickers adjustment on set. Ivanka Trump was in town this week. What was the president's daughter and one of his most trusted advisors doing here in the metro? And of all places she could travel to, why KC, Caroline?
Well, Kansas City is the 7th of 10 listening tours that she and Health and Human Services Secretary are on, talking about child care. So she visited some classrooms run by the Guadalupe Center at the Metropolitan Community College. I think she met briefly individually with some leaders in the child care industry here. And then Ivanka Trump, the Health and Human Services Secretary, Governor Mike Parson, and Roy Blunt all sat in on this big roundtable hearing from people in child care.
Did we learn anything new from this, Mary?
I didn't. However, I mean, I think anytime Ivanka Trump is a hard sell as someone who can speak to the general problems of a working woman. However, if she puts her voice to something that can help more women find access to good child care, I'm all for it.
Did you learn anything new? You were covering the visit too, Michael.
As was Caroline. No, what they talked about is daycare is expensive, that it's difficult work, and the people that are in it don't get paid well, and that it's a business with low profit margins on that. You know, stop the presses, okay? I mean, everybody knew that. What was interesting is there was a discussion about trying to get less conventional hours for daycare centers, to speak to folks that work on the second shift, somebody that goes in early and the daycare needs to be open for mom and dad then, or they got to work late and the daycare has got to be open earlier. And then there was this very quick but interesting discussion about the possibility of having small businesses combine their efforts to provide daycare for their workers. Trump said, well, that's something we ought to look into. But by and large, I don't think they broke any new ground there.
Okay, a quick quiz question for you. Can you tell me who is the chairman of the Federal Reserve? The person who leads what some say is the most powerful and influential financial institution in the world. How many of you even care? Well, the answer, yes, you're screaming at your television set. It's Jerome Powell, and this week he was making a rare stop in KC, meeting with area business leaders. It sounds important, but how did it have any impact on our lives? Caroline Sweeney, was he tossing around millions of dollars of the bank's money at random Kansas Cityans as he ran around Kansas City this week?
No, that would have been awesome, though,
Okay,
if he
all
just
right.
stood on the top of the Fed and started throwing money around. What they were really focused on
Snoop
was
Dogg
trying...
tried that over in Lawrence.
Yes, he did. He was really focused on small businesses, minority-owned businesses, and what that looks like on the ground when the Fed makes a decision. How does that impact small businesses here?
I think this was part of basically a political campaign on behalf of the Fed to say, look, we are an independent agency. Mr. Trump and the White House, hands off. We govern monetary policy in this country. We know what we're doing. Stop bagging on us for threatening the economy. I think this was a giant, and will continue to be, a giant campaign, PR drive, if you will,
Well, Michael, he said that.
to protect that.
Jerome Powell, the first
That
thing out of
was-
Jerome Powell's mouth was, we are not a political agency. We're independent of all of that, and he kept his line of the economy is in good shape while he was there.
Right.
They're always trying to get their word out. That's their public relations people are always
Yes,
trying to.
but they didn't contact me to mention this in the show. I just did it anyway because they sounded important. The news goes in cycles, and we are definitely in a cycle right now where one city after another is voting on giving legal protections to their residents who are gay, lesbian, and transgender. This week, it was the city of Westwood and the city of Overland Park, which actually became the largest city in Kansas to do so. But what does it actually mean? I was surprised pouring through the language of the Overland Park ordinance that the penalty is just $1,000. And none of that money, by the way, would go to the person who was discriminated against. As one council member put it, discriminating against someone for their sexual identity will be about as much of a criminal act as someone who makes an illegal left turn. Is that why one councilman argued this measure this week was giving folks a false hope, Mary?
I don't think so. I mean, to me, it certainly was a movement forward. Anytime that you have a city as large as Overland Park putting their foot down in a 10-to-1 vote with, I think they had one absent member of their council, and saying that this will not be allowed, this will not be stood for in our city, that's important. And that does send a message. It sends a message of acceptance to a broader community and to the whole community. I think it does say enough.
Michael.
I think it's a sign on the local level, and it's a policy on the local level. But what is far more important is what the Supreme Court does with the cases that they've just heard this past week, dealing with the very same issue of gay discrimination. Where that goes will have a lot more impact on Overland Park and every place else.
Well, it'll have the impact on how it can be fought through the courts.
True.
Does the
that's
civil
it.
rights,
That's
do the
impactful.
civil rights laws cover this? And is sexual orientation and gender identity covered within our current statutes?
Just briefly, it's also a further reflection of the changes in Johnson County politically over the years, which was nominally considered a fairly moderately conservative county, and yet council after council is adopting this. You have a gay representative in Congress. There are just a lot of changes coming to Johnson County or in place in Johnson County, which is interesting.
If you live here, you've been hearing for months about alarm and indignation in Jackson County over eye-popping property valuations. Now state lawmakers in Jefferson City finally hearing about what's happening. Testifying before lawmakers this week was the woman in charge of the assessment department, who claimed there's been a deliberate political strategy over the years to undervalue homes and businesses. Her predecessors may have caved to political pressure, but not her, she says.
Past administrations have jumped in and reduced the values over time. They want this current administration to do that too.
Is there evidence, though, that her predecessors deliberately manipulated the value of property to avoid taxpayer complaints, or because the political leaders they reported to pushed them into doing so, Michael?
The former county assessor, Curtis Coons, and a longtime member of the Jackson County Legislature, Dan Tarwater, who's been on the legislature 25 years, deny that that's ever happened. On the other hand, almost everybody you talk to during this entire assessment story says they do think that property values in Jackson County have been lower than they should have been, and they've been that way for a long time. What was really interesting in my take on this was the special committee of legislators very interested in what she said, and I don't think they believed everything that she said. There was a great deal of skepticism after her testimony.
When you put together a show like this every week, it's hard to get to every story making news in our metro. What was the big story we missed? KU apologizes for stripper poles as Snoop Dogg brings a less than family-friendly show to Allen Fieldhouse. There are 100,000 teachers in Kansas and Missouri. A new study wants to know why barely 1% are black men. With no problems to fix in Washington, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley is headed to Hong Kong. He spent the week blasting the NBA for apologizing to China. She was honored for her bravery, now a Jackson County deputy charged in the fatal shooting of a woman who was riding her scooter the wrong way down a Westport street. Could Six Flags fly over Worlds of Fun, the nation's largest theme park operator, making a big push to buy Cedar Fair, which owns Worlds of Fun? The company says the $4 billion offer is currently too low. Worlds of Fun has its own expansion plans. They're weighing a purchase of the now shuttered Schlitterbahn Park in KCK. What is one of you? These are all the options I am presenting, or did you pick something else as the story we missed this week?
Just for
Caroline?
something a little lighthearted, that KU situation just blew my mind. I woke up the day after and saw the statement from Jeff Long, and I was like, "What happened at KU?" I had no idea. I had to catch myself up.
That's what you said, too.
Yes,
I know, that's exactly what
I
I
actually
did.
clutched my pearls after that too. Michael Mahoney.
Well, you didn't mention that the Cardinals are in the playoffs, so I'll pass on that. Okay. This story about the lack of black men in the teaching profession, I think is fascinating. I think it's a serious problem, and it needs to be addressed. Very briefly, I remember the first time I met a male teacher, and what an impression that was when I was in school. I can only imagine what that's like.
Mary.
I would just spin off of more with the shootings in KCK. The Central Avenue Business Association, Betterment Association, is having their Dias de los Muertos celebration on November 2nd. And for everyone who is just mortified and horrified to the murders, show up on November 2nd.
So breaking news very quickly. I haven't even reported this yet, but there is a theory that the Kansas City, Missouri School District can be sued for not reducing its property tax levy under Hancock, and there are people in Kansas City who are considering that suit. More to come.
And that is our Week in Review. Thanks to our news reviewers. I'm Nick Haynes. From all of us at KCPT, thanks for spending part of your weekend with us.